From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. This week, the joy flows on. Democrats are taking advantage of the extended primetime commercial that is the modern presidential nominating convention to make the case for their new leadership. Delegates in Chicago have rallied with real enthusiasm to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Just a month ago, the party's heavy hitters were primed to make the case that Joe Biden was the man to lead the country for the next 4 years. Now, after a sudden change of mind and a hasty rewrite, we're told that Vice President Harris was the right person all along. Having made the switch, the party leadership has got three main tasks this week at the DNC. First, they had to dispense with President Biden. And they sure did, by confining him to a midnight appearance on the first night of the convention and waving him off to retirement straight afterwards. It is worth noting, just in case anyone had forgotten, that he is still actually the President of the United States. Second, they had to introduce and define Kamala Harris, who to most voters is still a largely unknown quantity. Husband Doug did a fine job on Tuesday night, painting his wife as a warm, likable wife and stepmother. And then Michelle and Barack Obama told us how she was going to bring the country together, apparently. Third, they needed to keep the focus as far as possible on what the media like to call vibes, and away from the issues and policies where voters continue to suggest to pollsters they have grave doubts about what the Democrats are offering. In fact, the only issue the Democrats do seem eager to talk about is abortion, which dominated the first night of the convention. So halfway through the week, with the big nights for Walz and then Harris still to come, how are they doing? I'm joined this week by Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. Moulton is a former Marine who served 4 tours in Iraq and then went on to earn a master's degree at Harvard. He entered Congress in 2014 and has been seen since then as very much on the Democratic Party's pragmatic wing, having served on the Armed Services Committee and taking a significant role in national security policy. He was one of the first members of Congress to publicly call for Joe Biden to step down after the president's debate performance against Donald Trump in June. And Seth Moulton joins me now from Chicago. Congressman, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Great to be here, Gerry.
Well, Congressman, as I said in my introduction, you were one of the earliest members of Congress to call publicly for Joe Biden to step down after that debate performance at the end of June. How pleased are you with the results as what you've seen so far?
Oh, my God, I couldn't be happier. I mean, the reality is that none of the excitement, the energy, the hope that's all around us here in Chicago was even in the cards just 4 weeks ago. So this has been a complete turnaround. I mean, one of the biggest turnarounds in politics, perhaps in American history.
All right. I take the point, and there certainly seems to be a lot of joy. I'm not actually at the convention. Travel difficulties prevented me from getting there, but we can all see it, and we see the joy. We keep being told about joy and vibes and all of this stuff. But is there anything more to it than that? Is there any substance to this, or is it all just vapor?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, the change in the polls is significant. The change in energy around the country in all sorts of races, up and down the ticket. I've talked to a lot of candidates I support through my organization, Serve America, that supports principled veterans running in key congressional districts. They report volunteers coming out of the woodwork, so much more energy in the community, so much more enthusiasm, donations up for their campaigns. So it really has been a sea change for the Democratic Party all around the country.
Clearly, that's because, we were being told by a lot of people that Joe Biden, until a month ago, was perfectly capable of being president and would be a perfectly good candidate. And we clearly learned that that was not the case, and we're being told something different now. But it does seem this energy is more about the fact that Joe Biden is no longer the candidate than rather than any particular enthusiasm. Is it real enthusiasm for Kamala Harris? It does seem to be the fact that you've got rid of, whatever one thinks of Joe Biden's record. You've got someone who people were really not enthusiastic about supporting.
Well, in some ways, I think that's kind of the point of this week, is to turn this new hope and energy to the fact that we just have a new candidate into real enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, who frankly a lot of people just don't know yet. And the speech last night from Barack Obama served to really introduce her in a lot of ways to the nation, to the world, and to the party here in Chicago. I think we're going to hear more of that over the next 2 days. And she's going to start laying out her plans for what she wants to do for the country. And importantly, I hope we'll hear some differences between her and President Biden. She was a loyal vice president to President Biden for 4 years, and they have a lot of accomplishments under their belt. But she's her own independent woman. and she's going to have some of her own policies. And I think that she can really differentiate herself on key issues. And that could be key to winning this election.
It's clear, again, from Biden's approval ratings that the Biden administration, again, whether you like the policies or not, is not popular. So how is she going to differentiate herself from that? You've just said she will highlight the difference. What will those differences be?
Well, look, a couple of the elephants in the room here are inflation and immigration. And I think she has an opportunity to show how she will approach those issues somewhat differently. And I'm sure there will be some similarities. I mean, we can all talk about how Republicans led a negotiation in the Senate to come up with a compromise immigration deal that Donald Trump then personally said, nope, don't do that. It's bad for my election prospects. So he sunk immigration reform. And I'm sure she'll talk about that. But she has an opportunity to also differentiate herself from President Biden and say, here's where I think the president could have done things differently. Here's how I will do things differently going forward on an issue that's on the minds of Americans all across the country. I mean, I represent a district in Massachusetts, and we recently did a survey, and it said that immigration was the top issue that people were concerned about up in northeastern Massachusetts. Another issue, of course, is inflation, and the Biden-Harris administration has brought inflation down significantly. Economists are raving about their achievements, but that doesn't necessarily translate into lower grocery prices. That doesn't necessarily translate into positive feelings on the street. And I think she's already trying to address some of those concerns.
All right, let's talk about those issues then individually. Let's start with immigration. And as you say, she's already put out an ad saying she'll be tough on immigration. You and the Democrats have attacked Donald Trump for blocking that deal that might have been had earlier this year. But suppose as being tough on immigration for Kamala Harris, how credible is it after nearly 4 years in which we've seen this explosion of illegal migration across the border, of criticism of the border force from a lot of people in the Democratic Party, an approach that the Biden administration seemed to take certainly right at the beginning, which was kind of an open, roll back many of the restrictions that Donald Trump had put in place. We've had this, as I say, even whether it's 6, 7, 8, now whatever millions it is, this extraordinary growth in illegal immigration. Is it really credible now for the vice president of that administration to turn around and say, hey, I'm going to get tough with illegal immigration?
Well, she has to establish that credibility, and that's my point. She has to establish that credibility. And let's get the facts straight first. Biden did roll back some of the Trump policies, mainly the ones that were put in place because specifically of COVID. And he said, look, COVID is not this pandemic. It's becoming endemic. It's just not the issue that it was 4 years ago or 3 years ago. And so some of those restrictions were eased. But you're right. Immigration went up and we're feeling it all across the country. We're feeling it in Massachusetts. Since then, illegal immigration has gone down significantly, especially in the past half year or so. And we need to talk about those trends and make sure that we have policies to reinforce them. But I mean, look, to be fair, Gerry, this is a place where I think you're right. She has to establish credibility. She doesn't have credibility automatically just walking in.
You're there in Chicago with the delegates. The Democratic Party likes to see itself as being friendly towards immigration. And one of the reasons I think the administration in its early stages took that position is because that is quite popular with a lot of Democrats. Again, even if she can establish that credibility, how is a message that we're going to get tough on illegal migration, how is that going to go down with their own Democratic supporters?
We are friendly towards legal immigration. We are not friendly towards illegal immigration. I want immigrants to come here. We all know they're critical for our economy. In fact, Donald Trump's plan to deport millions of Americans will dramatically raise inflation. That's just the basic economic analysis of that policy decision that he's chosen to make. But we want people to come here legally, not illegally. And that is a real problem that real serious immigration reform will address. Just simply, you build a 10-foot wall, I'll show you an 11-foot ladder. That's not going to solve things on its own. We need to incentivize people to come here legally because it's important for our economy. It's important for our national culture. It's important to American history. We are a country of immigrants. But we need to disincentivize people from coming here illegally. We need to have policies that make it clearly preferable, if you want to come to the United States, to do so through legal means. That's the kind of thing that the Senate deal, while not perfect, while it wouldn't solve every issue, was set to address. And that's why it was a bipartisan deal. So that's the kind of immigration reform that we need. It's the kind of immigration reform that Democrats support. And frankly, it's the kind of immigration reform that most Republicans support. It's just not supported by Donald Trump.
One of the challenges I think that Kamala Harris will face in terms of establishing the credibility that you say she does need to establish is that she took positions on many of these issues that are directly contrary to presumably the kind of positions that she's talking about, you're talking about now. You just said Democratic Party is in favor of legal migration, but not of illegal migration. But in the 2019 presidential race, we can all recall that moment when she, along with several of other Democratic candidates, said she was in favor of providing benefits to illegal migrants. She was in favor of essentially providing all of the kind of legal advantages and benefits that legal migrants have, that those the same would be applied to illegal migrants. On this and on issue after issue, whether it's that, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's on some of these issues of race and gender, things like that, she took positions 4 years ago that are very different from the positions that you're just outlining now. Isn't that going to be a big problem for her credibility?
Honestly, I think some of those positions were mistakes, and I think she thinks they were mistakes, and that's why she's changed her mind on some of those specific positions. Now, let's not forget, this is someone who came into public service as a prosecutor. She has often been hit by the left for being too tough a prosecutor. So she gets law enforcement, and I think that's why when she at one point made some of these calls during the heat of that campaign, the heat of that primary campaign when everyone was trying to outflank each other to the left, she made some decisions that she regrets, and she's gone back to her original position. Look, none of us is perfect. We all make mistakes, and we all sometimes change our views. Churchill famously said that you show me a different set of facts, I'll change my mind, or something to that effect. You're British, Gerry, so you probably know that quote better than I. But the point is, it's okay to say, hey, the reality is a little bit different right now, and I think that this decision I made was actually a mistake. I'm going to change that. And Americans like to see that level of honesty. I think actually that level of honesty helps establish credibility.
I think it was John Maynard Keynes, actually. Everything gets ascribed to Winston Churchill eventually, but I think John Maynard Keynes has said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What about you, sir? So, but I mean, I take the point, but it is pretty remarkable that someone just 4 years ago who now wants to be our president couldn't see what the facts were or how the facts were developing on issue after issue. And again, it's not just immigration and it's not just gun control or fracking or all of these things. We all change our minds, of course, Congressman, over certain issues, but changing your mind on like every single major policy issue that you ran on in the space of a few years, that suggests that you don't really maybe have much of a mind in the first place, doesn't it?
Look, Gerry, I just don't think that's fair. I think that there's been a few issues that have been highlighted, like specifically her position on ICE and benefits with regards to immigration. Her position on fracking is another example. But there's not a list of 20 different positions here. There's like a list of 5. I don't know exactly what it is, but I think that the reality is that there are some specific issues that the Republican Party, to their credit, is doing a good job of highlighting and emphasizing that give people the impression she's changing her mind on everything. And that's just not an accurate assessment of her record.
We'll take a short break there, but when we come back, I'll have more with Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton, and we're talking about the Democratic National Convention. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Congressman Seth Moulton, Democrat of Chicago. He's at the Democratic Convention. I'm not. And we're talking about the convention, what to expect in the next couple of nights, and what it means for the general election. All right, let's talk about the other big issue, which, of course, you've raised and where she has already started to roll out a policy, which is inflation and dealing with inflation. Now, she came out with this proposal last week based on this allegation that there is price gouging going on, especially by groceries in the food sector, and that she was going to kind of empower the government to essentially set prices. Congressman, I know a little bit about your political history, where you stand in the Democratic Party and more broadly on politics. Does that sound like sensible economic policy to you?
If it were exactly as you described, no. But I think what we heard from Vice President Harris was more of vision than real specific plans for implementation. The vision is that it's important for Americans that we figure out a way to make sure they're not unable to put food on the table for their families. And the public response to her speech when she talked about how important it is to see grocery prices come down, and she gave that speech in North Carolina, the public response was very positive. Then the economists dug into how are you going to do this, and maybe some information inferences from things she said in the speech and said, I'm not sure this is a good plan. She obviously still has some work to do on the details. She's really building this plane as she is flying it. We all know that she only became the nominee a few weeks ago. So I think it's fair to say that there are some issues with the details that need to be fleshed out. But you could say the same thing about the other side. I mean, we talked about how Trump has this plan to just deport millions of immigrants. And this is the same guy who promised us that he would build a wall and Mexico would pay for it. Two things that obviously didn't happen. And so one of the questions I have is, if you're going to deport all these immigrants, aren't they just going to come right back? Because you don't have your wall, you don't have border enforcement, you don't have a comprehensive immigration deal because you personally scuttled it. So that raises the same question for Donald Trump. I mean, you have this vision that we want illegal immigrants out of the country, but how are you actually going to implement it in a way that's effective and doesn't just dramatically increase inflation? Those are real questions. And I think that it's fair to ask some of those questions about some of the policy proposals we've heard from Vice President Harris as well.
Do you think grocery chains are price gouging and enjoying excessive profits as a result?
Well, there's some mixed data on this. I'm not an expert on grocery chains, but I do shop at grocery stores, and I've been shocked by some of the prices that I've seen. It's a little hard to believe that things literally double in price with the level of inflation that we've seen. So I'm not exactly sure, Jerry, but it does bear attention. It bears digging into, because this is a real issue for middle-class Americans all across the country. It's something that I see just when I go to the grocery store and get to the checkout register with my two little girls. I love to go shopping with my 3 and 5-year-old. They don't know what those big numbers mean, but I'm a little shocked by what that total comes to at the end of the shopping trip.
What about energy policy? Energy prices are obviously a very big factor when it comes to overall prices and to inflation. The US is very blessed to sit on an enormous reservoir of oil and natural gas. Republicans say part of the reason we've seen problems is that, or we could actually reduce prices significantly more, would be if we unlocked that potential. But Democrats do seem to have a pretty negative attitude. Now, again, I accept that Kamala Harris has gone back on her proposal of banning fracking, but is she going to come up with a policy that's going to really unlock the energy potential of the United States?
My view is that fossil fuels are not the future of energy here or abroad, but as long as we do depend in part on fossil fuels, it should be American fossil fuels, not fossil fuels that we import from overseas. Now, J.D. Vance recently wrote an op-ed talking about how important natural gas is and the potential that it has in America. But here's the reality, Jerry. Just this past week, we learned that natural gas prices are the lowest they've been in any summer for decades. So natural gas companies on their own are just stopping fracking projects. They're shutting them down because the market doesn't support it right now. So this is a case where the Republican Party is trying to make hay out of an issue that isn't really an issue, because at the moment, natural gas production is not accelerating in the U.S. because the companies themselves are saying we don't have the market to support it. Now, if you look at the record under the Biden administration in general, we've been producing more energy than we ever have in our history. So this is a place where Democrats need to really sharpen their messaging, I think. And I think that we should talk more about exactly what I said, that we want to lead the future of energy. You know, we should be the leaders in nuclear power, especially nuclear fusion, by the way, because in 50 years, that's how everything is going to be run. We should be leading the transition. I don't want to be buying solar panels from China. I want to make them here in America. But until we get there, let's make sure that the energy we rely on is American energy, so that we're always leading on energy policy, whether it's fossil fuels or renewable energies to come.
Before we get to Kamala Harris's big night, which is Thursday night, I should say we're recording this on Wednesday. Tonight we've got Tim Walz, vice presidential nominee. I wonder what you think about him. And Congressman, if I may start by asking you, you served with great honor and distinction several terms in the U.S. Marines in Iraq. Do you think that Tim Walz has been completely straightforward and honest about his military record?
Yes, I do. I think he made one singular mistake, which is like a question of 2 words. When he said that I carried a weapon of war in war, he should have said during a war, not in a war, because he wasn't actually in the fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan when he said that. But again, the fact that they're trying to crucify him on this one word choice when his record of 24 years of service in the National Guard is absolutely exemplary. I think it's really terrible. It's the swift boating coming up again. It's a clear campaign strategy from Republicans. It's right out of the playbook of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, a draft dodger who made up a medical problem to get out of serving in war and has consistently criticized veterans ever since. From when he was attacking John McCain for becoming a POW, for getting captured, a true American hero, to calling World War II volunteers suckers and losers when they actually got killed, to walking through Arlington Cemetery with his own chief of staff, Marine General John Kelly, and saying to John Kelly, I just don't understand why they did it. What was in it for them? That's his view of service, spoken to a Marine general who was at Arlington in part to see the grave of his son, Lieutenant Robert Kelly, killed in action in Afghanistan. So what's going on here is the Republican Party is following in the playbook of Donald Trump and the swift boaters of yesteryear and just attacking veterans for their service. Tim Walz is a terrible target because he has a really impressive record of 24 years of service to our country in the military.
You don't think, though, as a Marine Corps veteran yourself, who did serve, again, in war zones, you don't think that Walz has kind of deliberately left the impression with people that he was actively engaged? And actually, he talked about being deployed when, in fact, he was deployed in a support role in Italy. He slightly seems exaggerated the rank that he held when he left the National Guard. You don't think he's been sort of deliberately inflating his military record?
No, and let's go through these allegations one by one since you brought them up. Go ask a military family. Go ask the kids of a deployed soldier or Marine or sailor or airman, whether it matters where exactly they were in the world they are when they get deployed. Being deployed means being deployed away from home. I mean, you can attack Navy sailors for being deployed to the Persian Gulf during Iraq and Afghanistan when they weren't actually on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. Everyone knows that would be ridiculous. The bottom line is deployments are hard on families no matter where you go, and that's all he was saying when he was saying that he was deployed. It was an absolutely accurate statement. The issue with his rank is that he attained the rank of Command Sergeant Major, which, by the way, is incredibly prestigious. 1 or 2% of enlisted members of the military ever reach that highly prestigious rank. As a former Marine lieutenant, I knew that although technically I outranked a sergeant major, the reality is the sergeant majors outranked me. So there's tremendous respect for that rank in the military. The technicality here in Walz's case is that he hadn't completed his academic coursework to retire at that rank. So he retired at a different rank, but he served. And that's what counts. He served at the rank of Command Sergeant Major. So the bottom line is you go through these allegations one by one. They just don't hold water. And it's just frankly shameful that J.D. Vance, someone who should be proud of his own Marine service, he didn't serve in combat either, but he should be proud of his own Marine service for the role that he played because all roles are important. And rather than just celebrating the fact that you have 2 veterans on major party tickets, the chance that, we're going to have a vice president who is a post 9/11 veteran, the first time in American history. We should all be celebrating that. And rather than do that, J.D. Vance is, I think, really forgetting his Marine values and just following in the footsteps of draft dodger Donald Trump and denigrating those who serve.
I take your point, but there are some other questions that have been raised about things that Tim Walz has said. He did seem to make some kind of rather complimentary remarks about communist China after he made one of his visits there, came back and talked to his students about how communism was about sharing or something. I know, and I want to get onto foreign policy with you. You've been a very, very staunch advocate of a strong approach to communist China. I just raise this because do you think there's some questions here about just the speed with which Kamala Harris had to make this choice, and maybe was the vetting of Tim Walz maybe quite as rigorous as it could have been?
I think it's pretty rich to be asking questions about the vetting of Tim Walz when the guy on the other ticket is J.D. Vance, someone who said that his own boss, the guy to whom he's a total sycophant, Donald Trump, was America's next Hitler. Right? Well, you can dig through any of our histories and find things that we said that we may regret. But I know Tim Walz personally. He's one of the first people I met when I came to Congress because people said to me, Seth, you've got to meet Tim Walz because he's a great veteran. And since I really ran in the first place because of my experience in Iraq, feeling like I'd seen some of the consequences of failed leadership in Washington. And that's why I wanted to be a part of changing things by running for Congress, even though politics was in no way in my history. People introduced me to Tim Walz and said, he's a good guy. He's a veteran. I didn't know where he was from. I didn't know he held a highly Republican district. But that's exactly what I found out about him as soon as I met him, is he's a good guy. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what's going to come through to Americans. They're going to really get to know Tim Walz, who's a down-to-earth, great American, and will make an excellent vice president.
Again, very much of interest to you, former Marine. You serve on the House Armed Services Committee. We haven't heard a lot from Kamala Harris again about foreign policy. Maybe we will again tomorrow night. Presumably she will lay out a little bit. Again, we've had 3.5 years of the Biden administration. We can argue about the pros and cons of that. The Afghanistan withdrawal, most people think, was a bit of a disaster. Russia has invaded Ukraine. We have war going on in the Middle East. I don't want you to talk generally about it, but let's talk particularly about the Middle East and what a President Kamala Harris would do right now that might be different. You talked about her being different from Joe Biden and many differentiating herself. How would she handle the current war in the Middle East, the Israeli war going on in Gaza, the issue of hostages and the potential ceasefire and the risks of a broader war in the Middle East? How would she handle that in a way that the current Biden administration is not doing it?
Jay, it's a great question. And I think the honest answer is just, we're like 3 weeks in here to her nomination. We don't know yet because she hasn't laid out where her differences would be. I think that in large part, she would probably continue some of the core interests that the Biden administration is pursuing, namely not getting U.S. troops drawn into regional war in the Middle East and trying to tamp down those flames, which frankly is what's most in the national security interest of the United States, whereas you correctly state we should be focused on China. It would be the biggest gift in the world to both Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia if we were to get bogged down into a massive war in the Middle East, and I'm sure she'll try to avoid that. But there's a lot more to be fleshed out here. That's true, and I hope we'll hear more of it this week.
She declined to attend Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress when he was here a month ago. She said some things that are pretty critical of Israel. Is she going to be a reliable ally of Israel?
Absolutely. She said things that are critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu, echoing many of the same criticisms you hear from his own cabinet, from his own military and intelligence leadership. That's very different than being critical of the state of Israel.
Congressman Seth Moulton, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Gerry, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the DNC.
All right. Take care.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another episode. In the meantime, thanks for joining us and have a great week.